Johann in Law podcast. You get the information you need in terms you can understand and act upon.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Johann in Law podcast. I am here with Gordon Robinson, the president of Changing Management Solutions, a management consultancy firm with an emphasis on advising in M&A transactions. Welcome, Gordon.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Thanks for coming. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you can help M&A professionals and business buyers and business sellers get the outcomes that they're looking for?
You know, my practice actually is, it's called Changing Management because, lo and behold, I'm a change management expert. And depending on whom I'm serving, the projects look a little different. So if I'm working with an individual or a team or a corporation, the structure of what I do changes. With an individual, it looks like coaching. For a team, it looks a lot like high performance team development, offsite sort of thing, development for executives. But the reason that a company would contact me is most often because they're either preparing for or going through or even recovering from some M&A activity. It's the most common reason why people reach out to me, because they're either worried that the value associated with the M&A is not going to happen, or they're having some of the famous cultural mismatch that happens when you have a marriage of two corporations. But this is the reason that I get the call from a corporation as opposed to an individual.
Got it. Okay. So one thing I want to get into is this idea that a lot of M&A does not work out well for people. And we know that this is true across the different types of M&A. So a company buys a company for strategic reasons.
Yep.
At the public company level, at the small business level, it usually fails. Similarly, financial buyers, private equity firms, small business searchers, they tend to fail as well. And the MBA statistics are that somewhere between 70 to 90% of M&A activity does not reach its goal. Students in law school and business school learn that statistic all across the country, and it's quite alarming. So what do you think is behind those numbers?
Well, you know, it's funny because we hear that 50% of marriages end in divorce and we think that's just horrible. And yet 70 to 90% of M&As don't work out. And we're like, no, it's the cost of doing business. So I think I'm glad that you're alarmed by that. I think we should be alarmed by that, mainly because there's a lot of promise that's going down the drains in these deals that don't work out. They don't recognize the promise. They don't deliver the value. So I looked into that statistic that you just quoted, and there were three reasons that I was able to find, the main reasons why this failure happens, this lack of success. The first is overconfidence or unreal expectations of the deal and probably of each other among the companies, between the companies. The second was not understanding the target company's success factor. You really don't understand why the target company is as good as it is at what it does. And therefore, you may not work as the acquirer to make sure that they continue to get the things they need to get to create those success factors. And then the third is the one that I focus most on, which is people or cultural integration factors. That the people and the culture are just either mismatched, or that something goes wrong at the inception of the deal or on day one that causes a souring of what could be an otherwise promising marriage between two companies.
Got it. So I see a lot of that in my practice. And I think my practice is more at the small business level. But one thing I see is that, to start with the first one, the buyer is very focused on financials. And a lot of the reason for that is because that's what they're able to learn about. It's easy to crunch the numbers, and the numbers are very much available. And it's easy to theoretically say, okay, if we took over, we could get rid of these expenses. But they don't really understand what makes the company tick to begin with. And then they pull away certain pillars of the business and lots of things crash. So for many businesses that are getting acquired, they might have certain pillars that keep them successful, like the independence of the founder. Maybe the founder thrives on being able to do whatever they want, and that's why they're successful. Or maybe they have a key advisor who the buyer just wants to fire and say, oh, we don't need to pay this person. We can advise them better. Little did they know that advisor was keeping things going. So those are just some of the examples that I've seen. But what are some of the things that you see that really cause this breakdown in practice?
I like that you brought up financials. There is a huge focus in the deals that I've been up close with to get the financial model correct, that there's an answer and we've got to find it. That if we can get the spreadsheet and the financial model to work so that it's a viable deal financially, then everybody takes a breath. Like suddenly we can control this. So there's this huge effort to sort of control the uncontrollable because we can control the financials. The aspect of financials that I've seen go wrong, you remember there was a deal between two banks where they had what looked like it was going to be a very successful acquisition. And as soon as the deal closed, the sales team got right to work. They closed a big deal. Everybody celebrated. And that was the smaller company. The larger company was also delighted. But when the expense reports came in from the sales team, they were horrified because the smaller company had a belief about money that said you got to spend money to make money. So they lavishly spent on the process of wooing this client to close the deal. And the company that had acquired the smaller company was very conservative, and it really believed that they needed to be good stewards of their stakeholders' funds. So when they got some of the bills associated with the closing, that included large expenditures on alcohol and taking the client out, wining and dining, they rejected the expense reports. And the sales team was horrified. They said, this all of a sudden, this minor misunderstanding between two companies, very understandable, that was cultural, played itself out in the financial realm. So what happens is the FP&A or the people who are processing the expense reports say, we're not approving this. We don't approve this kind of expense. And the sales force said, fine, we'll cover it. But they go back to their camp and they say, these people are not serious about closing deals. They don't really want to close deals. And then, of course, the people in the people in the back office of the accounting department go back and say, you wouldn't believe what these people are trying to expense. These people are not good stewards of the money of other people. So all of a sudden now you have these two narratives that start to calcify and leads to tremendous misunderstanding and mistrust between the two partners. And all of this from what was a relatively innocuous misunderstanding that you could completely makes sense because nobody is talking about this stuff as you get ready to close the deal.
So why wouldn't that have been something that was flagged in the financial review? So if the accountants are doing the quality of earnings report, why wouldn't they have noticed at that time that the sales department had high expenses relative to the money they were bringing in?
I wish I had an answer that was the actual answer from that situation. I don't. I can imagine that there are a number of different reasons. Some of them are that I think the fervor, that the quality of due diligence is correlated to the desire to close the deal. Sometimes there's also, so sometimes it's that, look, we're going to have, okay, right, put a check mark next to it. We're going to talk about that just as soon as we close this deal. That's not a serious enough issue to stop the deal from going through. And when we get focused in the last couple of weeks, as you get focused on the closing, the issues really fall into two categories: the ones we can solve after the closing and the ones we have to solve before the closing. This might have fallen into that second category. So I don't believe anybody was acting with malfeasance, but I do believe that this was something that was overlooked or put to the side, and then it ended up biting you from behind.
One thing that I see in situations like that is that the accountants who are the quality of earnings accountants, the deal accountants, they want to cover their rear end. So they don't want to miss anything that can't be missed. They're not going to miss fraud. If something doesn't add up, they're not going to miss that. But something that could be an issue that isn't necessarily an issue, that maybe is an accounting issue that gets to a management problem rather than a financial problem, they don't even really feel like it's in their purview to raise that. So that's one thing I see from it's not the same to be a managerial accountant, like a comptroller of the purchasing company, versus being the deal accountant in the quality of earnings firm, which is often two separate jobs.
It's interesting because I'm glad you shone a light on that, because the scenario I just gave you, is that a financial problem? Is that a management problem? Or is that an HR problem? Are we talking about policy? Are we talking about financial discipline? Are we talking about style? It's kind of all of those things. So it would be an easy issue to either play hot potato with, or to say, we are going to handle that stuff on day one or day two?
I see it partially as it's not a finance problem per se, which is why the outside accountants don't flag it. But this is the issue, I think, with outside vendors versus in-house people participating in the diligence process. An outside vendor might say, oh, that's like a rate, that's a ratio that might be on the high end, but it's not for us to flag that. It's not wrong per se. It's not, it's not for us to raise every policy issue. But if the accountant doing that diligence was the in-house accountant, they would know right away, this is not a financial problem, but it's going to be a management or an HR problem.
Right.
So a really good outside accountant will, go into that kind of detail if the company wants them to, but many will not. So what can people add to the diligence process beyond just the financial review to try to attack some of these people-related management problems that might have their clues in the financials, but are not going to be flagged by a professional Q of V consultant?
What I'm looking for in the diligence process is not necessarily whether something is legal or illegal or reasonable or unreasonable. What I'm looking for is similarities or differences. For example, if you look at the expense picture on the financials of one company and it looks vastly different types of items, different things. We spend money on things that are very different from the firm that is acquiring us. Do they really understand our business well enough to know whether or not those things, they may be legal, but are they things that fit in with that new business? Sometimes with the business that's being, that is the acquirer. The second point that I brought out, this idea that you may not understand the success factors of the company that's being acquired, the acquiree, is a big one. I worked with a customer once. It was a large advertising agency, and they were missing in their vertical integration. They were missing a certain type of advertising that was popular at the time. And so they found a little company that was doing that type of advertising, that kind of marketing, and was winning all kinds of awards for it. And they purchased that small company. What they didn't know was that there was tremendous legal exposure associated with some of the ideation that went along with this sort of experiential marketing. And they hired all of the people who continued doing exactly what they had been doing and winning awards for. But when they tried to do it inside the bigger company, the legal team went berserk and said, you can't do that sort of thing. We have much deeper pockets. We will we will be sued for this kind of thing. You can't do it. They said, well, why? No one ever said back to them, but the question that was on everybody's lips was, why did you acquire us? This is what we're known for doing. You may have looked at our financials, but did you really look at our business and what we do? And it ended up being sadly, one of the 70 to 90% of results, because the value they were looking for, they really just didn't have the stomach to be in that business, but they acquired somebody who was.
That's one I see all the time. And there are many different types of, there's really an endless number of legal problems where that can arise. And it's kind of what I call the reverse of economies of scale. So the finance people are going to say, as the bigger company, we take the smaller company, expenses go down. Obviously, we're going to pay less for everything. But there are things that small businesses get away with that big businesses do not get away with. And that's one of the ways that the legal system is set up, or just society is set up in some ways to benefit small businesses. In many ways, things benefit the large businesses because they pay less. But it might be certain practices just fly under the radar for several reasons. There's really two ways you can get sued. A private actor sues you because they want to collect, but they want to sue big companies. Private actors usually don't sue small companies because, like you said, they don't have deep pockets. Then you have regulatory scrutiny. Regulators are similar. They're not in the business of disrupting what they see as harmless small business practices, but if they see a larger company engaged in the same practice, they can't necessarily allow that. And that plays out not only in a exposure to litigation, but also on the revenue side, where many of the deals and clients and work that the small business is doing is actually work that the larger business would pass on. So you can have issues with unions, with regulators, with IP infringement, whatever it is, depending on the industry. And that's not even going to be permitted by the legal department of the larger company. And what I see is that sophisticated private equity buyers, they often can flag these things because they have a tough legal team, and they have business people who understand the legal risks as well, and they understand their own risk tolerance. I see this much less from independent buyers. For example,
Okay.
they might be going into the healthcare space or whatever, where small clinics could be getting away with murder when it comes to their insurance practices or whatever, but a larger clinic or a larger healthcare institution could never get away with that. So I see a lot of that taking place in the liability management. So what else, what can people do to get aligned on these things? And why is it that a buyer who's in the same industry as the target wouldn't be able to see these things? Because it's their industry. I understand trying to get into a new vertical, but what causes these misses?
Sometimes it's a little more, I want to say, innocent than what we've been talking about. What you've been describing are situations that, like you say, with a top-notch legal team, you would hope that this would come out through the due diligence process. Other sources of cultural mismatch and misunderstanding between companies could just come from business practices. I did some work with a company that called me in and they said, our Chicago office is broken. Go to Chicago, fix the Chicago office." And I thought, boy, this is the deal that you might want to walk away from. I don't know what I'm walking into. So I go to Chicago. The company that had called me was in Florida, and they were all of a certain age. They had tea time at 3 every day. They had a very specific culture. The company that I went to in Chicago, first of all, I couldn't get in until 10:30 in the morning. The first thing that happened is somebody rode by on a scooter. There was a dog. I couldn't find the receptionist. And then somebody came up and helped me, but they had a neck tattoo and a nose ring. And I was like, that's cool. They look great. The problem was, I know the people that hired me in Florida, and I could see right away by walking in the front door why they thought Chicago was broken. They couldn't get Chicago on the phone. Chicago's conference rooming system didn't work. That's because they didn't have one. Everybody perched on couches, and it was very, at that time, it was probably 15 years ago. It was a very specific culture. It was urban. It was forward thinking. It was young, very young. That was not what was going on in Florida. So that's a complete cultural misunderstanding. That my question was, did no one from either firm go to the other office and simply walk the hall? Like, where did they consummate this deal in such a way that they had so little information about what the other company was like? It was utterly shocking to me in that it could have gone through an entire due diligence process and missed this thing that is, to me, was as obvious as the nose on your face. So this is not a legal issue. Nobody did anything wrong. It was just a very odd marriage. I would never have paired these two companies and said that that's a union that should happen.
Yeah, I see that a lot now because we're in the Zoom age. And so and that was 15 years ago. Now people are definitely not going to fly out
Yeah.
and meet in person and get to see the office. And that's pretty rare to see that happen. So now we're getting into more of the people mismatch
Yeah.
as opposed to the policy mismatch. A lot of times what I see is after a merger, people just butt heads. And
Yeah.
what often happens is it's not the management that butts heads, because the management has gotten to know each other quite well and they're basically on the same page. But the lower level people now have to integrate, and that hasn't necessarily been tested in the diligence process. Now people have new bosses and it can get messy.
I have one client who simply ran into the problem that wasn't even of butting heads, but this was a sales team, and they, after an acquisition, went to a regional model. And this leader in the sales team had one person in Australia, one person in India, a person in London, a person in the States. And it was a small team, but I mean, just the time zones alone that are represented on this person's team, they had never had any international management experience. They were untrained to handle the global issues that come to bear on a global team. And so this was just a miss. And of course, somebody said, we're going to handle all that. HR is going to cover that. And they're going to handle it as soon as the transaction is done. But they can't focus on that right now. The problem with hoping that HR will handle it on day one, HR is focused on getting the first payroll run out after we merge two financial systems. HR is busy trying to get all the people who took advantage of the early retirement reduction in force the appropriate letter that they need that guarantees them the deal that they signed up for, and making sure that nobody gets somebody else's letter. If you've got hundreds of people taking advantage of a reduction in force, I'll tell you that what HR is focused on, it's HR operations, not the part of HR that would worry about culture or people. And in that period of time, when we're waiting for there to be some breathing room, that's when that headbutting stuff happens. That's when the expense reports get rejected. That's when the people don't show up in the Chicago office. It's in that window where we're saying, we're getting to it. We're getting to it. Companies got to operate on day one. And people start looking for the value that's supposed to come out of the merger or the acquisition on day one. And by the way, honorable mention, is it a merger or is it an acquisition? I get very nervous when I go to a company and I've been told we are acquiring that other company. Go look at them, and I go and look at them, and they refer to it as a merger. I say, wait a minute. The acquiree thinks it's a merger of equals. The acquirer believes they're buying you. Just that mismatch can lead to all kinds of ruffled feathers and a bad start with regard to feeling in a relationship like you have value. Because I see employees concerned about two things when they are newly purchased is, do you actually value what I do? And please don't interfere with the way that I work. Please let me work. Those two things, am I valuable and can I do my work, are really some of the most important things on people's minds when they have just been acquired. So anything that sort of that gives them a reason to believe that they're not going to be valued in this relationship, or that they somehow no longer can do good work, that creates a morale problem that's hard to, it's a descent, it's a spiral.
Another thing I see, so you're talking about the acquiree comes in and now they have unwanted supervisions. Another thing I see is the acquiree comes in and they are supervising others. They might come in, they were upper management at the acquiree, and now they're maybe middle management or still upper management at the new company. What about the rank and file at the new company who's like, who's this person in charge?
Who's this person?
Yeah, because the rank and file still views themselves as the acquirer, even though maybe as an individual, they were lower on the totem pole, but they are part of the acquirer. So even if the acquiree is coming in and fitting into the system, they're still going to bring some of their own tactics. And in many cases, those new tactics of people who come in, it has a lot to offer. And it's a whole new perspective. And I've seen situations where you have great people who are, a finance whiz or a marketing whiz at the acquiree, and they don't even the acquirer doesn't even want to listen to them. And it can be for any number of reasons. They're set in their ways. It can be business reasons. It can also be personal reasons, because it might mean someone's going to get pushed out eventually if this new incoming staff member succeeds. So there are so many HR dynamics there. And I completely agree with you that the actual HR staff is so misunderstood because people don't realize what it takes to do HR operations. And I do HR operations myself. And that's really the job of HR first and foremost. There's the management's job is to deal with people and culture. Like HR job is to make sure people get paid and make sure nobody sues the company. And the deeper collaboration issues is a misunderstood function that gets improperly placed on HR.
A lot of these problems also have to do with effective or ineffective communication between two companies, again, where no one's doing anything wrong, but one company tends to work in person, or they tend, because they were small or local operation, they tend to work well, and they manage through town halls. They do a lot of town halls through their leadership, that kind of thing, versus a company that's very big, global. They rarely ever see each other in person, or if they do, it's for a special event. These sorts of things, you don't have to be the ink does not have to be dry before you can look at these things. There is a lot of information, like we were talking about before, looking at the financials. If you are, and I understand that deals have silent periods. They have all kinds of legal qualifications about who and who cannot talk to each other when. I understand that you never want to violate that. But it is possible to get good information that is at a level where you could at least say, okay, these two companies look at financials differently. We need to be sure we know who needs to have those conversations and when, and we need to plan them. We need to make sure we have an agenda for those ready to go. So that on day one is not when you start thinking about these things. It's when, if you can finally talk to the other side freely, that you actually start to do so right away, so that your initial meetings are substantive and covering things like different points of view on finance. You can look at the company's values. You can look at the company's mission statements and you can say, is there going to be a problem here? And again, you probably won't solve it during due diligence, but it should be on the table right away so that you don't wait until you get an awkward question at the town hall before you think to say, this is how we're going to deal with the fact that we view two aspects of doing business very differently from one another.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons why those things get missed is because of distractions. Because when you're in a deal closing process, there are so much technicalities to it, and as a result, and a lot of times the lawyers take center stage because their job is to actually close the deal. And so it's more about negotiating the terms and getting the financials right and doing whatever's the bare minimum. So it's like, that's really just finance and lawyers, and management is being pulled by those people. I need you to look at this. I need you to look at that. And the management doesn't always have the capacity to really assess what's going to be needed to create integration on day one. So yeah, it sounds like a lot of the alignment work is not taking place because management has a big role to play in closing the deal. The lawyers and the accountants need their help.
Adam, I would never insult my lawyer friends, and nor would I unwisely insult my investment banker friends. So I will reassure that I have sometimes been told point blank, we do not want you anywhere near this deal until it's closed. I said, well, why is that? They say, well, you might discover something that you then have to reveal that's going to interfere or delay our closing. I say, that's a short-sighted point of view. You know that the thing that your client, the CEO, is actually worried about is recognizing the value of the transaction, not just getting it closed. And that's usually when we stop speaking to each other for a little while. So I think your point is very well made. I think the leadership of the companies involved have to make it a priority, even if it's not what their lawyers and their bankers are telling them to do. They have to make it a priority to think about realistically, what is this marriage going to be like? And what are the questions we should be talking about that have to do with our mission, our values, and most importantly, how those things play out in our work behaviors, our ways of working.
Yeah, and I think one of the financial incentives that's a little bit off, at least with the investment bankers, is that they're getting paid at closing.
Yeah.
With the lawyers, it's not so much that the incentive is off because they're probably getting paid regardless, but they just don't see it as their job to. The lawyers have an expectation that other people are dealing with that. So
right, sure.
Yeah, exactly. So many lawyers are concerned, they don't want to overstep and start opining on this kind of stuff because nobody wants to hear from them anyway. So as we get into, evaluating whether the deal's even worth it, what people look at is valuation. How is this going to drive value long term? So how do these factors about human integration and culture integration actually bear on the value that's supposed to come from the deal in terms of, how much cash flow is going to come in after this merger, which is ultimately what everyone cares about.
When the leaders of two companies talk to their own companies about why we're undertaking merger or acquisition activity, it is rarely stated, oh, we're going to make so much money. That's just not the argument for the deal. The argument for the deal is we were soulmates, and as corporations, we were soulmates. We care about the same things. They have strengths that we lack, and vice versa. They're making an argument that's a value argument. It says, it just doesn't have a dollar sign in front of it. They're saying when we come together like a good marriage, 2 + 2 = 5, that there is value to be extracted from the union that we're contemplating. And we're all here to get excited about that. That's the tone that a CEO will use, whether they're the acquirer or the acquiree. They'll often stand next to each other and make these proclamations. And that's good. But that means someone needs to be thinking about how does that value get extracted? Yes, from fulfilling the financial model, there may be a reduction in force. There may be some redundancy that we're going to eliminate or repurpose. All of those things are great. But what's really important is that while everyone else is focused on the closing, like you said, we need those CEOs focused on where the real value, the real combination of the companies. What are those components? I had a friend who was in charge of a very large acquisition. It was back in the days when I think the first Bush was president, and they had the million points of light or 1,000 points of light analogy that he used all the time. And they called the 17 programs that had to return a positive result for it to be considered a success. So they defined success of the acquisition that way. They said these 17 things have to happen. They're like the 17 points of light. And each one of those was a project in and of itself. And then there was somebody who was a program manager over all 17 of those. And her job was to make sure that all those lights were green all the time. And they started planning this long before the transaction was closed. So that's the sort of proactive forward thinking that has you ready to turn left or right when you get to the closing, and now you have to deal with business on day one. So that stuck in my mind as a real shining example, no pun intended, of how to prepare successfully for a big acquisition.
So if someone's doing a big deal, let's say they've gone through the first step, they've made contact with the CEO, people are interested, but they haven't signed the letter of intent or anything like that or talk numbers. From that point forward, at what point should they bring you in to start answering these questions about people fit and culture fit? Do they wait till after the letter of intent, after the quality of earnings, after the closing? What's the ideal time?
Look, I'm so happy to be called in before the ink is drying at the closing that I'm ready to dance a jig. The earlier the better, because what I will initially help do is advise the parties on how to think about possibilities with the other firm. What is it that drew you to them initially? And is that turning out to be where the actual value lives? So the consultation can start much more slowly if it starts earlier. I think that when you call somebody who does what I do in near the end, we're almost trying to catch up, or we're almost trying to clean up what we should have been doing 3 months ago or 6 months ago.
All right. Awesome. Thanks so much, Gordon. Appreciate you coming on.